Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.
Welcome to the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly. I'm Bob Clifford, president of the Chicago Bar Association, and I have the privilege today of introducing to all of you a Chicago legend, a national legend, Mr. Newton Minow. Mr. Minow is currently senior counsel at the Chicago office of Sidley Austin, and he is the Walter Annenberg Professor Emeritus at Chicago-based Northwestern University. After serving in World War II, Mr. Minow completed his law degree at Northwestern University, and after that he worked as a clerk for then sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Fred Vinson. After that, Mr. Minow also served as assistant counsel to the Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. Mr. Minow also has worked on the presidential campaigns of both Adlai Stevenson and President John F. Kennedy. In 1961, at the age of 35, Mr. Minow was appointed by President Kennedy as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a position that he held and made changes in our country's landscape in ways that we'll talk about during the course of this interview. Mr. Minow also authored 4 books and numerous articles. He's the recipient of 12 honorary degrees and several awards, including the Chicago Bar Association's John Paul Stevens Award. So, Mr. Minow, welcome to our show. Thank you so much for being here.
Bob, I'm honored to be here with you.
Well, you're very kind to say that. You know, when I was trying to prepare for this interview, I couldn't help but think about where do you start with a fellow like you? And I'll tell you what comes to mind, a fact that I haven't read anywhere, but I know something about because you shared it with me. You had something to do with President Obama getting hitched to the First Lady. Could you tell us about that?
Whenever I see President Obama, and I saw him actually last Friday, he always says the same thing to me. He says, "Thank you for introducing me to Michelle." And I said, "I didn't introduce you to Michelle." He says, "Yeah, but if I hadn't come to your firm, I wouldn't have met her." I said, "Well, that part of it is true." What happened is that I have a daughter who was President Obama's teacher at Harvard Law School. And she called me one day, my daughter Martha, and she said, "I know your firm doesn't hire first-year summer interns, but I've got one student here who is so exceptional, I think you ought to take a look at him." I said, "What's his name?" She said, "Barack Obama." I said, "You better spell that for me." So she spelled, and I called our partner in charge of hiring, John Levy, and I told him, and he started to laugh. I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Newt," he said, "we've hired him already." He said, "We've heard about him. Before you ever called, he's hired." We came to the firm, and we always assign a lawyer to be a supervisor, and we assigned Michelle Robinson to be Barack's supervisor. That's how they met.
There you go. Well, thank you for that. You know, Newt, you've had such a remarkable career, and so much of it is based upon television and everything that you did with the Federal Communications Commission. What in your mind, I'm going to be jumping around a lot, but what in your mind is the single most important accomplishment of the FCC under your leadership?
I believe we expanded choice for the American viewer. When I went to the FCC, there was no public television. There was very little cable vision. There was no satellite vision. There was no public radio. It was a very limited choice. There were only 2.5 television networks. Many cities had only 1 or 2 television stations. Homes usually had 1 television set. The whole family gathered around to see 1 program at one time. It was a different world. And I believed that we had to expand the range of choice, and we did.
Let me take you back to the time when you were with President Kennedy. what was he like in terms of his openness to your vision of communications and the future of television in our nation?
Well, President Kennedy was very sophisticated about television. He knew that he would never have become president if it weren't for television. He knew that his debates with then Vice President Nixon were largely responsible for him becoming president, so he was very sophisticated. I would hear from him occasionally about something on television. He was keenly aware of its importance. He invited me to go with him on a tour of the space agencies, and that turned out to be very important because of communication satellites.
Right. I'll get to those. Let's stick with the presidential debates for a moment. You hold the view, I believe, that the presidential debates, both at the time of President Kennedy versus Vice President Nixon, and going forward even until today, really changed the landscape of voter thinking across the country. Is that right?
I do. I think most people make up their mind about who they want to support before they see the debates. But I think there's a certain percentage of viewers who are affected to the point of changing their mind or being energized to vote. So I think they're exceedingly important.
Right. You know, when we talk about television, and maybe even before we started today, we were talking a little bit about, at least as a citizen, it strikes me that TV commentators all the time, they applaud failure and ignore success, and there's a lot of rancor that goes on. How did you and your colleagues at the FCC address any of those things and the balancing of their right to do that with the First Amendment but also knowing that it impacts opinion in a way that maybe is a little tilted?
Years ago, there was a doctrine that the FCC followed called the Fairness Doctrine, which basically said broadcasters should deal with controversial issues, but when they do, they should present all sides. That today is no longer the policy because it intrudes really on the First Amendment. So we really trust our broadcasters to provide all sides. Today, what we've got are certain channels the Fox channel reflects a conservative point of view. MSNBC reflects a liberal point of view. Today, because there's so many channels, it's a different system. I think there's a lot to be said for having more voices, but also I think it's very important that our country get all sides of the issues.
Right. You know, when you were talking, I couldn't help but think about an initiative of the Chicago Bar Association to expand civics education in our elementary and secondary schools. Where in your mind do civics fit into the broadcasting realm? Anywhere at all?
Well, I think one of the most important things that you were doing as president of the Chicago Bar is getting lawyers more involved in teaching our students about civics. When I was a kid and went to public school, civics was a required course in school. It should be a required course in school, because if you don't understand civics, which means understanding the democratic process, understanding how laws are made, how laws are enforced, you really can't function as a citizen, as a responsible citizen. So I think it's essential that the lawyers and that the bar and that the judges do everything they can to teach young people, in fact everybody in our society, about civics, because that's their civic responsibility.
Well, you know, hopefully we're going to be doing some programming on civics, and it's a separate standalone topic, and when we get to it, I'm going to lean on you again and ask you if you'd come back and talk to us a bit more with a larger group.
Well, I'd be glad to, but I congratulate you for leading the Bar Association in that direction. It's needed.
Well, it's an important issue for all of us as Americans. You mentioned, you know, the First Amendment. The First Amendment wouldn't have gotten the recognition that it does were it not for what the FCC did and does. I think. Is that right?
I think you're right. I told the president, the FCC is the only federal agency that deals with a medium of communication.
Right. You mentioned with President Kennedy that you visited the space facilities, space administration facilities, and I think you and he had a bit of an exchange about the importance of satellites.
When I went to the FCC, and I'm not a technologically adept person, but one of the senior commissioners came in to see me today and said, "Do you know what a communication satellite is?" And I said, "No." He groaned. He said, "I was afraid of that." He said, "I've been trying to get people here interested before you came, and I hope I can get you interested because this is important." I said, "Well, educate me so I'll understand it." So I made a point of studying, and at that time, the Russians were far ahead of the United States in space. They had sent a man into space, we hadn't. But he convinced me that the one area where we were ahead of the Russians was in communication satellites. The communication satellites enabled us to transmit voice, pictures, whatever, across the oceans, across the continent. So I knew it was important, and when President Kennedy invited me to go with him to visit the space installations, he called me over one day and he said, "Why you keep pushing this communication satellite? What's so important?" And I said, "Mr. President, sending a communication satellite into space is more important than sending a man into space." He said, "Why is that?" I said, "Communication satellites will send ideas into space. Ideas last longer than people." And I think today we see what's going on all over the world. We see what's going on in our country. It's all because of communication satellites.
Right. Going back to that era, did you see a future that had 340 channels on Comcast or what have you, DirecTV, for UHF, VHF, all the things going on? Were you able to see that?
No, I knew that through cable we could greatly expand the choices, but I had no conception that how far it would explode. And we're not done yet.
Well, and that's what I was going to, is that now that you live this so much, where do you see the internet taking us? Where do you see communications going? We'd like to know.
I think the internet is probably the most important invention since television. I think the internet has enabled all of us to communicate in ways that none of us ever dreamed about. Today, we just commemorated 9/11.
Right.
It's only 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there was no YouTube video. 10 years ago, there was no Facebook. 10 years ago, there was no Twitter or tweeting. This has happened so fast and so transformative that I think all of us are just rushing to catch up and understand it.
Sure. And do you sit back and just say to yourself, my gosh, where's this going to be in another 10 years or 20 years?
I do, and I think that every day. I see with my grandchildren, they don't even have television sets. They watch television through their computer. They prefer to communicate with you by the internet rather than by the telephone. So it's a revolutionary, massive change. You and I are lawyers. We're now communicating through the internet, through emails, in ways none of us could have possibly conceived of only 10 years ago.
That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is.
How do you like our new mayor?
I like him very much. I've known him a long time.
Have you?
Yes, and he's very interested. He's very interested in public television.
Yes, he is. Well, he's a big supporter of public television.
Right.
You know, public television's in trouble. Well,
Public television is in serious trouble. It's in serious financial trouble. When public television, I've been involved in it from the beginning. I was privileged to be the chairman of PBS years ago. Public television has never been financed properly in our country. Unlike, let's take two countries. Let's take Japan and the United Kingdom. There, everybody, in order to have a television set, has to pay a license fee, and that goes to provide a public television service, the BBC in England, NHK in Japan. We've never done that here. And as a result, it relies mostly on contributions and philanthropy. There's a minor federal funding, but it's a small part of what's needed. We really, the marketplace does not provide certain things. The marketplace does not provide great children's programs like Sesame Street.
Right.
The marketplace does not provide great programs like Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. And until, because of that, we've got to find a way to better fund public broadcasting.
Sure. And what's the role of government in that? I mean, you say it's public. I mean, why aren't we funding? Why isn't government funding that?
Public television really took off during the administration of President Johnson. Vietnam War was on. The proposals for public television all involved some form of funding. There was one specific proposal that every time a television set was sold, there would be a $5 fee that would go into a fund for public television. President Johnson didn't want to increase any fees or taxes because of the war, so it never happened.
All right. You mentioned the series on for Ken Burns. I think there's a new one of his coming out.
There's a new one coming out. Ken was in Chicago this week. I saw him. It's a new one about prohibition.
All right.
And I heard him talk, and I learned so much that I never knew.
Sure.
I think the whole country will learn a lot.
Sure. Now, that was during the Depression era. You grew up in the Depression era.
I did. I was born in 1926. Calvin Coolidge was president. I'm still around, and I grew up during the Depression and still have a Depression attitude about things.
And that's not a bad thing to have a Depression attitude about things. Well, what do you think is encompassed in that in terms of fiscal responsibility?
Well, I think there's several things. One is the role of government, and that's where we're having this big debate right now in our country.
Right.
Should the government help people who can't get jobs? Should the government help people get medical care, which they can't otherwise afford? Should the government help education, or should it not? And there's a big debate in our country about the role of government, and my own sense is that somewhere in the center is the correct view. We don't want the government doing anything, but we don't want the government doing nothing. The government, without law, without government, you can't have law.
Sure. You worked with President Kennedy. What other presidents since President Kennedy have you done work with?
I was appointed by President George H.W. Bush to a commission right after the Iraq War, first Iraq War ended. There was a big argument about whether women should serve in military combat.
Right.
There were big divisions
big fights
of opinion.
about that, right.
And President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission, which I served,
Right.
on that question. And again, you had the wild extremes. You had some people who said women should be in the infantry on the front line. Some women said women shouldn't be in the military at all. We carved a middle course, I think, which exists today. So I've served President Bush, I served President Clinton on again, a bipartisan commission dealing with digital television. I've served the Department of Defense after 9/11 during the second President Bush administration. And I feel because of my role in the presidential debates, I can't be partisan. I try to be either bipartisan or nonpartisan.
Sure. Tell us when you, well, here, first off, tell us what role you had with the presidential debates. I know that, but I don't know that our viewers do.
Well, let's go back to 1960.
Right.
There were no such things as presidential debates.
Right.
I had urged Adlai Stevenson, when he ran for president in 1956, to try to have debates with President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower had recovered from heart attacks. I thought it was unnecessary for President Eisenhower to run all over the country in a campaign, and but Adlai didn't want to do it, so it never happened. But in 1960, Adlai Stevenson wrote a magazine article that proposed presidential debates, and Congress got interested.
Right.
And Adlai was called to testify in the Senate. I worked with him on his testimony. And the problem was the law. There was a law, the equal time law, said that when a broadcaster gave or sold time to one candidate, must do the same for all candidates. Well, there are 243 candidates for president. 243. You can't have a debate with 243 candidates. So there had to be some judgment about which candidates had a chance to win and which, and so we went to Congress and made some proposals. Congress exempted the 1960 presidential election from the equal time law.
Okay.
One time only, 1960, only for president. That led to the Kennedy-Nixon debates.
Wow. Did you attend those?
No, the first one was in Chicago, and I happened to be in California, and there were no VCRs, there were no recordings, so I left a very important meeting with a client because I was going to see it. There were no debates between 1960 and 1976.
Why?
Because the candidates didn't want it and Congress didn't change the law. In 1976, the FCC, and I was involved with this, changed its interpretation and said that news events were exempt and a debate should be treated as a news event.
Okay.
That was taken to court and we won.
Right.
But that led to the debates, and the League of Women Voters asked me to organize them. So I became co-chair. And I called a friend of mine, Dean Birch, who had succeeded me later as chairman of the FCC. He was in the Ford White House.
Right.
I called him and I said, would President Ford participate in the debates? He said, I'll call you back. Call me back. He said, President Ford wants to debate. I said, would you tell me why? This is the first time we'd ever have a sitting president participate. He said, Newt, if you're 36 points behind in the polls, what the hell else are you going to do? So then I called Jimmy Carter's people.
Right.
I knew Bob Lipschultz, the president's lawyer. And he said, I'll call you back. He called me back. He said, Jimmy wants a debate. I said, you tell me why? He said, we know we're 36 points ahead, but Jimmy doesn't think the country knows him. And he wants to be, and he's a very confident debater. He debated when he ran for governor, so he wants a debate. Well, so we then negotiated what became the first debate since 1960. I co-chaired it again in 1980. 84, the league and the candidates were not speaking to each other. There were, so we organized what is now the Commission on Presidential Debates, which still exists.
Right.
I'm the vice chairman of that with Senator Danforth of Missouri.
Right.
And we've run every debate ever since. We always have the problem of who should be included. What do you do about a Ross Perot? What do you do about a John? So we have a rule that if you have 15% support in the public opinion polls, you'll be included. If you don't, you're not. And that's worked pretty well so far.
That's pretty good.
Yes.
That's wonderful. And do you participate in trying to make sure that public broadcasting has as equal a role in being involved in those as does the big networks?
Yes, I do. In fact, very often we have chosen a public broadcasting person to be the questioner. Jim Lehrer of PBS has done more of the debates than anybody else in the business.
Sure.
And so public broadcasting has a big role.
I love gossip, so give us a good gossip story from one of these.
Well, they get in such arguments about such trivial things.
Yeah.
One time I was negotiating the debates, and one of the representatives of one of the candidates said, "No notes."
No notes.
I said, "All right, what would the other guy say?" He said, "Okay, no notes." Well, then they got nervous about people bringing notes out of their pocket, so they insisted that the candidates be given a certain color paper. Otherwise, they wouldn't allow. It got silly. One time, my favorite story, I was negotiating the debates in 1980, and the negotiator for the Republicans was James Baker, later became Secretary of State, very good lawyer.
Correct.
The negotiator for the Democrats was Robert Strauss,
Okay.
later became
Secretary of Defense.
right. And we got in an argument about, I don't even remember what it was, but we got to an impasse. And Strauss said, "Excuse me, I have to go to the men's room." And he left. About 3 minutes later, Baker said, "Excuse me, I have to go to the men's room." So he left, and I was there with the women from the League of Women Voters. They came back in about 10 minutes. They had an envelope they pulled out of their pocket. They said, "Here's the deal." These were two Texas lawyers who had known each other. They worked it all out, and they said, "Here it is." And I didn't want to argue. I wanted the debates to go forward. I said, "It's done." And so that was my favorite of the negotiations. Some of them have been very unpleasant.
Oh, I'm sure. Let me switch gears a little bit about your life in the law and the practice of law. You've spent the bulk of your career representing corporations, individuals. What have you done?
I'm one of the last of the generalists.
Okay.
Everybody today is a specialist in this or a specialist in that. I've represented families, businesses, individuals. I've had individuals who came who had been adopted, trying to find their real blood parents. I've represented individuals who were being threatened with an undesirable discharge from the military because of their political views. I've represented large companies. I have been privileged to enjoy a career as a lawyer in all sides. My 3 daughters are all lawyers, which surprised my wife and me enormously. We never anticipated that.
How many years have you been married now?
62. And my wife and I are very fortunate to have raised 3 kids. We have grandchildren. So we've had combined a very happy family life with a very busy career.
Well, you've led a life that so many people admire and respect, including a gentleman that I know well and have great admiration for, Abner Mikva.
Abner and I grew up together as kids.
Right. He's a very well-known Chicagoan, as are you, and the two of you have had quite a history together.
Abner and I were in high school together, and we were both competing to be editor-in-chief of the high school paper.
Right.
Abner beat me, but he then appointed me sports editor, which turned out to be better than editor. Then we each went to law school. We served in the military after that. Abner was in the Air Force as an officer. I was in the engineers as a sergeant in the China-Burma India Theater. We came back and went to college and law school. And University of Chicago, where Abner went, recommended him for a job as a law clerk at the Supreme Court.
Right.
Northwestern, where I went to law school, recommended me for the same job. So we each went for an interview, and I met with Justice Minton, who had been on the Seventh Circuit here, and that was when I was on the Supreme Court. And he interviewed me, and he said, you know, he said, I'd like to hire you. I like young people from the Middle West. But he said, yesterday I wrote a letter hiring a guy, Miska? I said, Mikva. He said, that's it? And I said, oh, he's my oldest friend. So I called Abner from Washington and told him. He didn't know he had the job. The letter hadn't arrived. Fortunately for me, not long after that, the Chief Justice lost a law clerk, Dan Walker, who later became governor of Illinois.
Oh, goodness.
He was an Annapolis graduate. The Korean War was on. He was called back to the service, so there was a vacancy. And the Chief Justice hired me. So as a result, Abner and I were there together.
Wow.
We were there the same year with Bill Rehnquist, who later became Chief Justice,
Right.
with Warren Christopher, who became Secretary of State.
Right.
We had a very distinguished group who were with us at that time.
And you worked on some really important matters for our nation at that time. One of them, as I recall, Brown versus Board of Ed.
Yes, Brown was pending, but it kept getting postponed. Finally got decided after we left. We were there during the steel seizure case. That's when President Truman seized the steel industry because there were strikes threatened.
Right.
And the issue was, did the president, under our Constitution, have the authority as president to do that? And the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, overruled the President of the United States.
Wow.
A very important case.
Well, contrast that with what President Reagan did with firing all the air traffic controllers.
Yes.
He took over that industry.
He took it over, and of course, the controllers had promised not to strike,
Right.
and they had violated the law.
Right.
And
that was the key difference.
that was the key difference.
Right. You know, I can't help but think, at the risk of being patronizing, about how fortunate we are as a city and a nation that someone like you devoted so much time to public service. And I say that, and then I lament the fact that a lot of our young people today are staying out of public service because we seem to demonize everyone who tries to put their name forward.
Well,
what do you think about all that?
Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy always said, politics is an honorable profession. And John F. Kennedy said everybody should spend part of their life in some form of public service, whether it's serving on the school board or whether it's park board or whatever. Somebody should, everybody. I believe that very deeply.
Right.
I believe that part of the role of being a citizen in a free country is that every one of us must contribute somehow to the public service. Unfortunately, and I think it's because of Vietnam, Watergate, everybody became very cynical, particularly the press.
Right.
Journalists began to believe that everybody in public life was either a crook or was somehow taking advantage of things. They became very cynical about public servants and regarded everybody as having bad motives and didn't believe anybody. Instead of trusting what a public servant said, they started off with the idea, they must be lying to us. That has unfortunately sickened the political process, in my opinion. Even though I'm a Democrat, a lifetime Democrat, I admire and respect anyone who will be willing to run for office. I often support Republicans if I think that they're the best candidate. Senator Percy just died. We were very involved
What a
Senator
nice man he
Percy's
was.
campaign. In fact, I'll tell you a funny television story about Senator Percy if you've got the time. But the need for all of us to devote some of their time and effort to public service is essential if we're going to survive as a country.
Right. Tell us about Senator Percy. I've met him a couple of times, and I just walked away saying, wow, what an impressive individual.
So even though I'm a Democrat, we supported Senator Percy. One Saturday, I was home. Senator Percy called me. He said, "Are you busy today?" And I said, "No." He said, "Will you do me a favor?" He said, "I'm going to be in a television appearance, a joint appearance, with my opponent, my Democratic opponent, Congressman Roman Puczynski. It's going to be on Channel 9 in about an hour. It's going to be live. Would you watch it? And when it's over, I'm going to call you. I want to get your advice." I said, "Fine." Well, it was a Saturday, and I tuned it in, and I was in our library room. We have a big sofa, and it was a Saturday. I was tired. I lay down on the sofa. I watched it for about 15 minutes. It was exceedingly dull, and I fell asleep. The end of the program, Senator Percy called me back. He said, "Did you watch it?" I said, "Chuck, I have to be honest with you. I watched the first 15 minutes or so, but I was tired. I was on the couch. I fell asleep." He said, "Oh." He said, "Well, here's my question." He said, "I don't think I did very well in that hour." He said, "And my agreement with Congressman Puczynski and WGN was that program would be broadcast once, and that was it. Puczynski wants me to release it so it can be made available to all the television stations. What do you think?" I said, "Chuck, if you say no, the press is going to be after you and saying, 'What have you got to hide?' There's going to be a front page story, 'Percy hiding, won't let the program be on.'" He said, "Yeah, but I don't want it to be on." I said, "Well, I think what you could do is say, okay, it can be rebroadcast on one condition. It has to be broadcast entirely unedited for the full hour." I said, "No other station will take it." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I can't guarantee it, but I said, my judgment is no other station will take it but if you say no, you're going to be in trouble." He said, "Are you positive?" And I said, "I think so." Well, he tried that, and of course, no other station put it on. That was the end of it. So Senator Percy now regarded me as his television advisor. But I always remember that because he was, I think he would have been in trouble if he had said no.
Sure. You know, did you ever foresee that, or look back on your life in broadcasting and say, wow, you know, I've had this great life in broadcasting, but I really wish I did something else? Did that ever strike you? You know, do you have any laments about that?
No, I've loved being a lawyer.
Right.
I've served on a lot of boards. I've served on business boards, large companies, small companies. I've served on a lot of charitable, not-for-profit boards.
Right.
I've been very lucky. I'm chairman of a large foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, chairman of the Rand Corporation, which you were involved in, the Rand Corporation, which does wonderful work for our country.
Right.
So I'm on the board of the Mayo Clinic, which is one of the great American institutions, in my judgment.
Certainly
If we had enough Mayo Clinics, all our health care problems in this nation would be solved overnight.
Right.
So I've had a blessed life.
Right. How come you never ran for office?
I've been asked to. I don't have the temperament for it. I'm very sensitive to criticism. You've got to have a very tough skin if you want to run for office. I also see what it does to family life. I've seen how totally demanding it is. So I never wanted to run for office. I've been asked to do it, and I've always said no. I admire people who do run.
Right.
I take my hat off to them.
Right, right. Where do you think, you are senior counsel to one of the largest, most prominent, most successful law firms in the world. Where do you see the legal profession in the decades ahead and its ability to serve our community and our citizenry?
I think without lawyers, we could not have a civilized society, because the law is what separates us from the jungle.
Right.
Lawyers, the one thing I don't like about what's happening now is that people are becoming more and more and more specialized. The idea that you've got to be an expert on Section 322 of the Securities Act,
Right.
or the idea that you've got to be a defense lawyer only in malpractice cases, or the idea that you've got to be an expert on environmental law and Section 526 of the EPA. This is wrong. Lawyers have to be broader citizens. I keep telling this to my daughter, my middle daughter, who's the dean of Harvard Law School. They've got to educate lawyers in a broad, not a narrow way, and law firms have to try, if they can, to do pro bono work in areas that they don't practice in, so we can make more contributions. Being a lawyer today is tough economically. Young people getting out of law school I got out of law school at a good time. You could get a job.
But you did something I thought was pretty good. You were able to combine, if you will, your undergraduate degree and your legal studies, and you saved a little time there. Why aren't we doing that anymore?
Well, as I look back about it, what I did, I went to Northwestern, and at that time, if you got into Northwestern Law School, your first year of law school
Right.
would count as your fourth year of college. And I was in such a rush to get through school, trying to make up time for the time I spent in World War II in the military, which I look back at today and it was foolish, because I never felt that I got the kind of education that I wish I'd had. So that's why I try to keep learning now to catch up with it.
You're quite, you read. I've been in your office and books everywhere. What are the favorite things that you look into and like to study and read about?
Well,
escape to?
Well, I try to read everything. I read, I try to read a book a month. I read too many magazines. I spend too much time. We counted one time, I think we get 18 magazines at home. I read 4 newspapers every day.
Wow.
I watch, my wife says I can do 2 things at once. I can keep the television on and watch it and read, which I probably don't do perfectly, but I've always wanted, I was just watching in Jackie Kennedy's interview that was just made public when she was talking about her husband. She said he reads even when he's eating. He reads all the time.
Right.
And I think I admire that. I think I'm the same way.
Yeah. Did you know the father, Joseph Kennedy?
Yes, I did.
What was he like?
Well, I met him before Jack Kennedy was president.
Right. Was he this tough guy that's we've seen him portrayed
Well,
in the series?
I had a wonderful experience with him. He, the day I gave that very controversial Vast Wasteland speech,
Right.
I had 2 phone calls that night at home. One was from Ambassador Kennedy.
Right.
And I picked up the phone. They said, the White House calling. Ambassador Kennedy on the phone. I thought, oh, here it comes. I'm going to catch hell for this. He says, Newt, he said, I think your speech was the best speech since my son's inaugural address. And I've told him that. And he said, you keep it up. If anybody gives you any trouble, you call me. Goodbye. Hung up.
Pretty good.
The other phone call was from Edward R. Murrow, who called me and he said, you stole my speech. I said, what do you mean? He said, you don't know about my speech I gave in Chicago 2 years ago? And I said, no. He said, I'll send you a copy. And he said, he gave a better speech than I did, but it was the same message about the public responsibilities of broadcasters. It was the same speech.
If you had to give that speech tomorrow, would you say the same thing?
I think I would. I think the speech was in many ways misunderstood.
Right. Well, this is your chance before 8 million people to clear the air.
What I was really saying to the broadcasters was, you got to remember the context. This was 1961. In the late 50s, television had two scandals in a row. It had the quiz show scandals where there was corruption. It had the payola scandals where people were paying disc jockeys to play their records for money. There were scandals at the FCC. There was corruption. President Eisenhower had to fire the FCC chairman and get rid of him. There was a mess. There was a mess in the industry. There was a mess in the regulatory body. It was not a wholesome place. So I felt it was important to change the atmosphere, to change the environment. And I wanted to remind the broadcasters what an extraordinary privilege they had been given. They'd been given the exclusive license to use public property, part of the spectrum, keep everybody else off. They could have exclusive, in exchange for a bargain, that they would serve the public interest. That was the bargain.
All right.
They were making millions and millions of dollars using public property exclusively, and they had to give something back in the form of public service. That was my message. That got lost in the two words, vast wasteland.
Right.
The two words I cared about were public interest. That's the words in the statute, in the law, that governs broadcasting. But people forgot that, and they only wanted to talk about vast wasteland.
Well, you have certainly exemplified public interest in not only the way you conduct yourself and your career, but everything you've done. You know, one of the, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that you were the recipient of the John Paul Stevens Award, and the Chicago Bar Association gives out in honor of Justice Stevens, fellow Chicagoan. And this past Monday, we announced the winners of that, many of whom you know, but when we give someone that award, we do it because of their professionalism, their commitment to integrity of the legal responsibility that we all cherish and we all hopefully are doing in a way that exemplifies civility and credibility and honor. And so for you to be one of the original recipients of that, and I know that I spoke to one of the recipients this week, and I read to her the names of those people, and she said, I'm humbled to be in the kind of league with the likes of Newton, Minow, and some of the others. So,
well, you know, Justice Stevens was finishing law school when I started.
Okay.
And I met him there. And later years, at the Aspen Institute, I took a course that he taught called Justice and Society. And it was the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever undertaken. We used to play tennis in the afternoon with Justice Stevens and his wife. He is a great, great man and an example of what all of us would dream to be as lawyers.
And on that note, thank you, Newton. Newton Minow, we've had a great experience with you today. I can't believe that the hour went by so quickly. We've all enjoyed listening to you and the remarkable stories that you had to tell us. So thank you for your years of service,
Bob,
and thank you for your thoughtful insights today.
To be here with you and to be with the president of the Chicago Bar Association, leading us in new ways, is an honor for me.
Well, thank you, sir. Folks, I'm Bob Clifford. Thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly.
Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.